I was actually tempted to play bad cop today, but that positive thing kind of puts me on the spot now. So I'm going to take something from Jason. What I loved about watching Creative Mornings videos from afar is seeing the ones they put online and see how there's kind of a narrative. Each one seems to lead into the next. And I really like how Jason he took the idea of the theme last time and played with it a little and extended it. So I actually met Victoria first on the internet. I'll embarrass her by saying I saw what she did. Are there any Buffer users in the crowd? Anyone here working for Buffer? I'm just double checking to be safe. They made a change I really liked. They got rid of auto content generation, and I just tweeted them that it was awesome. And this girl jumped up and said, I agree. And I saw community architect in her job title. And I thought, what the fuck is that? That sounds awesome. And as a startup, we're all about community, as I'll sort of touch on. So I DM'd her, and she's blushing now because she never replied. And this was maybe 6 months, 8 months ago. Maybe 2 weeks ago, we're in Helsinki. I just flew in yesterday. I've been living in Finland and Paris. And this sparkly jacket was at a startup weekend. And we got chatting and sort of comparing notes, and just something bugged me. I was like, hang on a minute, you're fucking familiar. Like, where's this from? And I jumped through and I'm searching, and then I noticed, yeah, it's the DM she never replied to. So I got to have that moment of you get to do in this tech world and creative world where we bump into each other a lot in different ways. And I was like, this is you, motherfucker. So it was a really good way to meet. So we talked a lot about time and timelines, and she's kind of railroaded me into have a chat today. I kind of also like the idea that a lot of what we talk about in terms of our timelines of what we do is kind of bullshit. We refactor and reform a lot of the things that we've done. Even that story, it's true, but we can embellish it to be funny, or I could embellish it to be sad. This community architect didn't reply to me. What kind of community is that? So I came up with the theme as linear is a lie. And I'm a little bit older now. I'm kind of at a really good point in my career where I can look back and actually own some of the awful bits. The feeling when they happen, they look at these heads nodding, but we pretend it doesn't. The LinkedIn looks amazing. Our Dribble is carefully curated. What we present to the world is just this idea of kind of not what we are. I like subtitles. So the first one, you probably saw the blurb on the site. It's too big, so I had to trash that. So I asked Victoria, can she help me brainstorm what we might kind of subtitle with? The reality of the subtitle for linear as a lie is really that. Disowning, then re-owning the fucked up bits of our careers and who we are and what we're trying to portray as creatives. Maybe it's kind of any copywriters here? We could kind of brainstorm some of the copy, convergence, attack on creative careers, the jobs. So Victoria and I kind of went nuts over 1 million coffees on this idea that we're actually working jobs that haven't existed even a few years ago. And we're creating careers that will extend beyond that into jobs we don't even know exist yet, which I thought was kind of cool. But eventually we came out to a nice subtitle that basically we're going to talk about an outlier journey to success. And I like this kind of subtitle because it comes into 3 words that I think are really cool. If there's anything we take away, it's going to be sort of on those lines this morning, the outliers and what that means in terms of having a journey and your idea and definition of success. But what I was going to say changed when I look at the attendees list. I quickly clicked through a bunch of people. I think it was 200-ish, and I think you divide that by 3 usually for events in Australia. So I found out that in the room we have, or at least in the attendees list, a fucking startup founder that sent a book into space. Into space. They're probably in bed because that's an awesome. You don't have to get out of bed anymore if you've sent a book into space. A drumming beekeeper doing 100 days of typography. I thought that was a pretty awesome summary of themselves. A community architect with glitter jackets for days. I don't even know what that means, but there she is. A designer using processing languages to create generative installations. That was really, really cool. Someone who studied to be a lawyer. This is a safe place, no judgment, but I hope you've moved on to something more creative. Okay, if you need to hashtag anything, this is the beginning of a dialogue for anyone that wants to to communicate. I've done a bunch of crazy shit. The network is pretty cool. If you think there's anything I can help you or your project with, feel free to tweet me anytime. It's actually the best way, unlike Victoria, Twitter is the best way to get in touch with me, because I won't read your email because it's in there with a forest of other emails I'm going to ignore. So what are we going to talk about? Examples, lessons, and a challenge at the end. So I wanted to talk about, or Victoria wanted me to talk about, a career path, how I got to doing what I'm doing. That was our first couple of conversations. I wanted to. And usually you start with your first job, and then there's the thing you did that gave you character. Business books actually use this as a template. You know, we've ghost written a couple. You had that early job that gave you grit, and then you proved to your boss you could do it, Devil's Wear Prada style. And then you had that bit where you showed a bit of flex, and then you became awesome. I wanted to show you that, but it's fucking bullshit, because in reality, it's only what you do now and a bunch of other shit that happened beforehand that you cherry pick from. And I'm sure most of us can relate to that. Your LinkedIn, like the top one, is the one that looks really good. If I guess as creators, we don't always lean on LinkedIn, but I have to use it a lot at the moment. And it's really some other bullshit that you fit in there. Even if you look at mine, you'll see there's a couple of areas where I've glossed over just a little bit. So who am I? I'm the founder of a company called Gorilla. Gorilla is, we make technical writing software. It's, in our space, kind of a nerdy thing. Essentially, we've made a CMS. And the CMS we made for a company called Red Hat, which was the world's first billion-dollar open source software company. It was an internal rogue startup we made without permission. By the time I left Red Hat, we'd taken over 2/3 of the company's global software documentation. We spun that out with funding from Red Hat's co-founder, which was the first person to take venture capital money for an open source company. So hitting the $1 billion mark gave us a really interesting idea and experience of what it means to be a rogue internal startup. And then we spun this out. So I was in Australia and India and the US for a while, but then we became the first international startup accepted into an accelerator called Numa in Paris. Paris, France is a little bit different to Australia, as you can imagine. Finland in Helsinki is a little bit different to Australia. And I've just moved to London, I think 12 hours ago. So thanks for having me, guys. The reality, though, is when a lot of people meet you, and Victoria sort of met me and had a look through the LinkedIn and see what you do, and they see that you're a startup CEO. They see you're a startup CEO backed by one of the most famous technologists in the world. And you have all these kind of things that you can kind of spin up, and often we do when we're on stage. But the reality is you get talking, and it goes a little bit deeper. So it's what you really do. What does a startup CEO actually do besides stress, starve, and occasionally have money that they give to other people? And we kind of touched on, like, that is an interesting thing that I think everyone in this room, if we had that conversation, you would tell me graphic artist, or let's do a quick poll. Are there any designers? Okay. Any lawyers? That was good. Any accountants? No, because I need one. That was more for my bad. But illustrators, I know there's at least one. Oh, look at you guys, you're in a row. That's fucking cool. You're a little gang. Awesome. So, but if we dug deeper than that, it would go further, and it gets very, very difficult. So I'm going to jump an example of how that narrative unpacks over time and what that can really mean. So I'm going to give you a super famous example and 3 super not famouses. I'm sorry for anyone in typography here. So the super famous one is Steve Jobs, right? So everyone knows who that guy is. Spoiler alert, he was actually a bit of a fucking asshole in real life, but we idolize this guy, and we idolize these examples of his narrative. And one of the ones that I love is that we actually have design on computers because of something that he did as a hippie. Now, if you have read his biography or know a little bit about him, and I come from the tech world where he was a competitor to my main investor. So when my investor, we have a couple of calls a week, he talks about that asshole Steve from back in the day, from sitting next to him and fighting with him. And they thought he was just actually literally a shoeless, stinky hippie that was not even bothering to go to university. He was just turning up in a typography class. And this has become the super famous example for what we do with our career narrative, that this somehow hippie asshole becomes one of the most influential technologists in the world with one of the most valuable companies we've ever heard of. Yet when he was trying to live on juice and spend no money and eat hippie food, he was actually wandering into typography classes, which no one understood at the time. And it gives us the ability to use Comic Sans MS in front of a room full of designers. That's awesome. So the super not famous examples are 3 things that I hear, and these are actually quotes I've had from my board of investors. I had one ask me, what the fuck does coal have to do with being a CEO? There's something that our company was doing recently, and I should start with this photo that makes me laugh. This was It's hard to see, but it's my first selfie when I got sent to work in the US as a business analyst for a coal company. They made us put on this protective gear, PPE. I had the shiniest, cleanest, and I was actually ironing it every day. So someone told me that that's not a very manly thing to do in a coal mine, is to iron your protective clothes. So this is my proudest photo to my family, is like, look at me, I'm now legitimately like as masculine man as you can actually get, until I went on a coal site and see what they really look like. So the question I keep getting is like, what the fuck does coal have to do with being a startup CEO? How are you running a team globally? How are you guys changing the face of technical writing? You know, our company makes technical writing awesome again. What's that got to do with coal? But there's been so many times I've been in a board meeting or in some kind of strategic point where I've looked back and realized that whole journey I had in coal mines gave us the competitive advantage to do what we do now. Like one of the areas that we sort of had a lot of fun with is our company takes all the software documentation for software companies and we throw it into a really interesting system. So we have tens of billions of records. As a technology company, we struggle to work with that sometimes, but we're constantly drawing influence back from when we ran the supply chain analytics for a coal company. So my investors just sitting there listening to me talk about this system we built for a company called Peabody, where we're taking all their internal inventory. And I had to actually write down the minutes of the meeting if that question kept coming up. It's like, why the fuck you keep talking about a coal company for? But I just said, trust me. And having the trust them, we got to do this example and we applied it. And this crazy outlier thing of me living in the most redneck state in the US, somehow sitting in the middle of Paris became this example that the exoticness of them gave them the trust to let me try to do something. And it turned out to work. But I heard this other exact quote again. What the fuck does music have to do with being a CEO? When I started in the music industry, I wanted to find this photo, but I was actually so embarrassed by it, I probably deleted it. It's the first ever gig I did in a giant warehouse. It's me by myself, playing to absolutely nobody, with a little sampler and a little turntable and a little keyboard. I have it vividly in my head, but it was such an embarrassing photo in the magazine that came to cover this gig that we didn't keep a copy of it. Now, ironically, the one we use is just a quick grab from some of the videos online. So when we actually finished this band, we were touring Europe. We were doing the usual stuff that you like to do in electronic music. So we went from like a venue of absolutely nobody, which was embarrassing and shameful, to venues of 10, 20, 30,000 people jumping around to dance music. And what I really wish, and it's the first thing when Victoria and I were talking, is like the things that you find really embarrassing originally. I don't have a copy of that photo. I'd love to show you guys because it would be such a strong part of the narrative to say, look at this point in time that was embarrassing and fearful and shameful, but it would be totally fucking awesome right now to show you and say, look how you go from a skinny little guy standing up in front of no one to be able to do this thing. In terms of the narrative we could have unpacked, it's a missed opportunity. So the takeaway is if there's something you're embarrassed about in your work right now, save a copy of it because it's probably going to be interesting when you're up here next year and Creative Mornings telling a story about it. And I also did hear this one too. What the fuck does technical writing have to do with being a CEO? Does anyone know what technical writing is? Anyone at all? No. Exactly. Right? The funny thing is, so when you used to buy software, you used to get these giant manuals, these big textbooks. When you study at university, the text you get, the stuff that they prescribe you, that's always way too expensive, that academia seem to love is technical writing. So they talk about this field of authoring as technical writing. When cars are manufactured, the guides that tell you how to keep them safe and secure, how people in factories put things together, this is all technical writing. A field I had no idea about whatsoever because I'm going around living in coal mines and jumping around on stages and doing all this other crazy shit. But it turns out that this field is a multi-billion-dollar area of publishing. So all the times I was struggling to get articles published as a writer, struggling to get gigs in a band, doing all these things thinking as a creative, I love to write content, we can put it together, like we can throw the stuff together. I had no idea there was a multi-billion-dollar industry just sitting right under the surface. So when we had one of the investors one day ask me, what the fuck does technical writing have to do with being a startup? Why should we give you money for this thing? What is this thing? I remember smiling to myself and thinking it was so lucky that one day I was so desperate to actually make rent that I went into a software company and said, do you have any content jobs? What do you content people do? Now, that point of desperation that pushes you to actually go and ask those questions. Like, here's the stuff I can do. Do you have anything like this? And they said, we've been dying to find technical writers. We just can't hire any of them. The funny thing is, because no content people know what the fuck technical writing is. You don't jump on your monster.com or seek.com and say, type in technocrat, you type in writer or journalist or creative or copywriter. These two worlds don't overlap. So it was kind of profound to me to realize and hear how desperate these companies are. Like for me now, this is being recorded, so I'll have to actually be a little bit careful. If you think of the four most famous technology companies in the world at the moment, they're desperate for technical writers to the point where I can't actually open my LinkedIn some days because they're just constantly hitting you to hire you. So if there's any content people here that like technology, you probably don't realize there's an industry out there that's dying for you, that will fly you to San Francisco within a week, without exaggeration, on $100,000, $150,000 a year. And yet I think of all the times I used to sit there doing $300 articles for magazines back when they even paid, with that sense of starvation in you, not understanding that there's this narrative in there. What's kind of interesting for me is, remember that point of going from a magazine journalist to technical writing, is I didn't realize that, hard to see with the lights, but the guy on the left is a guy called Bob Young. He founded Red Hat. So he was a typewriter salesman, and then he realized there's a thing called Linux, which is an operating system for software. Does anyone know Linux at all? Wow, look at you guys. It's way geekier than I thought it'd be. That's awesome. So Linux was this thing that was like a joke. People used to make fun of it because Microsoft was awesome, right? And Oracle was awesome. And there'd be nothing else ever. And yet somehow this guy on my right took that and took the open source world and somehow made it work, made it a multi-billion-dollar company. And then he spun off like multi-billionaires do, and he created a sports team, or bought a sports team, and a bunch of other things. And then he met this jerk on his left at a conference in New Zealand, where I was actually risking my career to go and do a talk about something I was doing internally. And we got on like a house on fire. And the secret to actually getting an investor, if you want a little tip on the side for startups, is we had a really honest conversation. I talked about how I nearly got fired at Red Hat for doing an internal startup, or every time we got in trouble, or how I was actually just getting sick of the job. I was getting bored. I was wanting to do something innovative. And he smiled at me and said, "Who are you?" And I gave him the usual bullshit story. I'm a technical writer, blah, 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 like the top line of my LinkedIn. He's like, no, who actually are you? And we talked about music, we talked about publishing, we talked about not being able to pay rent, we talked about all those like reality things. And then he said, "I don't know whether to hire you, acquire you, invest in you, or partner with you." And I just sat there and I was like, whoa, this is like a startup book. This is the beginning bit. When it gets to the middle chapter, you know, the nice bit, like, cool. I'm in one of these. I could be one of these. And then I looked at him and said, well, let's do all four, but we'll do one at a time. So how does this whole giving me money thing work? I'd love to see my Google history, because I think most things as a startup CEO, like forget everything you see in the movies. It's basically you and Google. It's like, dear Google, what is HR? Dear Google, what is diversity? Dear Google, how do I take money? Like seriously, the amount of times. So getting from that point, and this is actually kind of touching me, from this point where I was unhappy in my job, if anyone had asked me, I would have said, technocrat, awesome, yeah. We co-founded PressGame, 2/3 of Red Hat's global software documentation. We published 800 books in 24 plus languages. We had that spiel down pat, but it was bullshit. We were unhappy and bored. Until I met this guy. And then the other photo is me a few weeks ago at Demo Day, presenting to the world our startup in Paris. It was the grand finale of our accelerator project, and getting flooded by offers from angel investors to come on with the round that we're opening soon, our seed round. And I like this little meta journey, and there's a lot of awful shit in the middle of that. But to go from one point of discontent to a point of walking across the stage to seeing a bunch of people with money, which you don't really have a lot as a startup, I don't want to spoil that for you, and feeling that sense of success. So here's some lessons I got from that. They're both profound and painful. And we might move kind of quickly through some of these, because I'll put all the slides up. I really think the first one, it takes a second to dig through and read those if you want, but the first one I think is kind of true, and we can make this a dialogue. Jump in any time that you guys feel you have a comment or question. But outliers are essential. I think that is absolutely one that I've learned over and over and over and over and again in my career. The funny thing is, I worked for this coal company at a time when jobs were pretty hard to find in Australia. The financial crisis was brutal. So I was sitting in a room full of people, and they had MBAs, multiple masters, they knew what they were doing. And at the time, I didn't even have my undergrad, because I was touring the world in a band. I didn't bother finishing my degree. And yet I kept getting the job, and I kept getting the job, and I didn't realize why. I realized it was because people don't want to work with boring assholes that have spent 20 years doing an undergrad degree, a master's degree, a PhD or something. That's a great way to go. But what I like about creative tech communities is you guys have great stories. The typical business world doesn't. I kept finding that my outlier stories of living in Serbia, what I did in India, all the crazy adventures we had made you more employable, more interesting. So the things I used to be ashamed of, like being that little kid sitting in a club by myself playing to, well, the bar staff, became an interesting story of why a boss would end up hiring you. I think number 2 is really strong. Does anyone disagree? We're at a creative event, so clearly we're not pursuing the money trail specifically. So I think that have faith that the money follows. That might just be a coping mechanism that we have at time, but I think it really, really does. Success follows good work.
You're talking about outliers, you're talking about experiences in your life which make your experience different to anyone else's.
Well, that's interesting. I think comparison is the enemy of happy. So I don't think we should look at outliers as against other people. I know my example then kind of was, but I think outliers in your own journey. So if you look at, say, the LinkedIn of a lot of really successful people or the career paths, I don't think most of those, or at least the stories they tell when they write the book about themselves, they're never saying that I went to this primary school, this high school, this university, this postgrad, this and that, like a straight line. They might, but they're pretty boring people, right? And usually they're the ones that have the least happiness. I think that most of us would get excited if we spent the whole day just somewhere all rotating and speaking to each other. It would be the crazy stories and the weird things and the failures that would be most interesting. So I think of an outlier as, I was born in a mining town where you get married before you're, well, as a teenager, and you're probably in jail or working in a coal mine by the time you're 20, if not both. 3 days ago, I'm speaking at a conference in Helsinki, Finland, which is the other fucking side of the planet to where I was born. Like, that's an outlier experience to me. It's like, how the fuck did I get here? And there's not a single day where you don't think, I'm so grateful for these like crazy adventures, outliers that I've had. So I think of it as more just something that's pushing your extremes in a certain direction. Purpose in the process, I think that's a pretty fair thing. So working for an open source software company, we're all about communities. And I think we sort of learned that rather than having an identity attached to what our jobs were. So as a business analyst, I used to introduce myself as that to people. Then the financial crisis came along and smashed that. So did anyone get retrenched, have some trouble during the global financial crisis here? Were you creatives pretty well off? No? Well, Australia just got smashed in the face, and America got smashed. So anyone that had their identity attached to their job learned very quickly that when Enron disappears or Lehman Brothers disappears in a hurry, I think a whole generation of us had to learn to find our identity again in things. So I think the purpose comes from the process. Failure is empathy with time. Anyone disagree with that at all? When you have an awful experience, I was in a startup weekend in Australia, and we were an awesome team. I did the final pitch, and I bombed it badly, terribly. It took probably 3 days to even want to think about that experience, but it actually became a hilarious, awesome example for everyone else. They've used the footage of me bombing terribly doing a pitch because they're able to put on the end the pitches I do now around the world when we get our investors. At the time, I wanted to delete this, like that photo of my first ever gig, but having that sense of empathy over time and having the successes and the wins afterwards made it kind of a point of pride. Like, I now look at that and think, yeah, that really sucked, but I'm glad I did that in a fun venue rather than in front of a couple of multimillionaires that would have been like, the fuck is this guy? And the importance of closure. Anyone working on side projects? That should be every hand, right? Like, everyone's got a kind of something. I don't know about you, but I kind of abandon my projects when I'm bored with them. That little thing on the side you do, you don't really land it, but it becomes part of your narrative, right? It becomes part of something you can talk about in the future. So the big lesson I've learned in the last year is like learning how to land and wrap up and package those things. Like to say, this is the finish, this is what I learned, make sure the URL's preserved, do that final tweet from the Twitter account, that kind of thing, I think is really interesting. Kind of a hippie one, number 6. I love this. Don't be known for saying no, because yes has a funny way of happening. The product we built at Red Hat was reimagining the way that companies do publishing, which is pretty bold, right? So think of it like an Evernote. The founders of Evernote, imagine how many times they heard, what's the point? It's just Microsoft Word, right? This exists. Why would anyone want to use a web service? Like Google Docs, who cares about this stuff? But yes had a funny way of happening. And we found that ourselves. The first time I had an idea for the product, which is now a multi-million-dollar company with a team spread all around the world. The first time I had an idea for this product, an ex-Apple employee with 2 PhDs said, look, I'm an expert in this. It's never going to work. And I made the mistake of listening to him. And he became known for saying no. So the day that we actually got him to say yes was a profound reminder of like, pardon my language, but fuck that guy. The minute someone says that'll never work should be a clue, even as creatives. Like, that's a hint that you're probably on the right path. Approaching projects as a sense of community, that just makes life a lot more fun. This room is full of really interesting people. There's no point sitting, just the fact you've gotten out this morning and come into the venue makes it a lot more enjoyable, right? There's nothing I'm saying that you couldn't read on medium.com or filtering through a lot of Twitter feeds. But the fact that we're able to get in the space and do those stretches and look at glittery jackets and eat awesome food kind of makes it a lot more interesting. Do things with purpose? Yeah, or the opposite, or just fuck around. I've actually played on both angles to try to work out, should I do 14-day projects? Should you do something? I love that there's the whole, do a month. There's someone in the room, I saw someone feeds, they're doing like a 30-day typography project. I thought it was really, really cool. I tried that and I got to 2 days and then I just parked it. But they were kind of 2 awesome days. I learned a lot about typography. So as a conversation, if any of you have a feeling like, is it better to do something as a hardcore purpose, or is it okay just to fuck around on your side projects, I think is an interesting conversation. Everything you do becomes your narrative. I've learned this the hard way. You can't escape this stuff. I tried to bury that photo of myself playing to an empty room, and it just kept coming up again, people reminding me, until it's became a good part of your journey. I'm kind of interested. I'm really interested. Have any of you got any examples that you found that similar thing, that something that was just a thing on the side has become a really interesting journey or an interesting event? Yeah?
I did 2 months working for a publisher in publicity, and I didn't get on well with my manager, and I got told to leave quite unceremoniously, and thought that was the end of my career in publishing. But it was the beginning of me becoming a freelancer in publishing, which is a very rare thing, and it was the best thing that happened to me, but it was devastating.
What I like about that is, one, getting fired from a publicity company is kind of happens, right? But I like that people that hit these pain points of an organization. I've heard quite a few people who are awesome freelance and content people that have graduated and moved into advertising or moved into something that they thought they needed to be in, then realize it kind of sucks, or they realize there's pain points they don't like, or they don't like the culture, and they get spun out and spat out or fired in that case. We hate to say the word fired. I worked it as the global financial crisis affected below-the-line projects such as mine, was something I said in a job interview once. When in reality, my team got fired because the company just thought the project sucked. And that stays with you for a long time until you can kind of own that. But then when you analyze, why did we get fired? We got fired because the company sucked. You don't think that at first, but it makes you a better content person. So I like that example because I hear that quite a fair bit. Reflection, I think, is obviously a really important one too. Like, as I'm talking, I can see a lot of heads sort of nodding and thinking about their own examples, and we don't make space in our lives for that reflection on all these little projects we do or side things. Even what you're doing here in Creative Mornings right now, that's a side project for a lot of people. I see the amount of things that Victoria does, I'm kind of blown away. I think people can make careers out of side projects. It's fascinating. But that sense of reflection, I think, is really, really important. So make the most of the time you have afterwards to talk to each other, or the community minutes that you have. So the challenge. We tried to think of a way to do graphs and flowcharts and images, and being a business analyst, I wanted a whiteboard to sort of map things out. But we realized that we can't put a structure around this. It is the challenge for all of us. How can we remember that we are in this together? How can we remember that what we're doing makes interesting career narratives? How do we get from the crazy outlier experiences? So the reason why I'm keeping a little bit freeform is I want to sort of dig into a couple of experiences that you guys have had. Like, how do you think we can get better as an industry, as creatives, especially as technical creatives, to explain what the fuck we do? Like, how do you sum it up? Like, I'll put some people on the spot. Like, how do you sum up in 20 words what you do? I know, it sucks, right? Yeah. But we have an opportunity to sort of begin that and to get like a community language together to say, I'm saying the word technical creative a lot because I'm actually seeding that in your heads. I'm trying to get that into my own dialogue recently because I'm sick of trying to explain people at airports or on flights. I hate just being a startup CEO. That's actually kind of an embarrassing term. It means that you're pretending to do a job for a company that's probably going to go broke, right? There's a lot of blogs about startups, and every time people talk about our company being a successful startup, it actually makes me embarrassed. It's like, cool, it's playtime. When do I get to be a business owner? So technical creative sounds a hell of a lot better, right? So maybe if we have some time in the community minutes, we can sort of touch on that. I always want to sort of end with that, right? Like, you got up, you woke up, you came in here. I don't know how far you guys commute. Like, London's fucking enormous. I'm missing my Finland commute of about 10 minutes, but it takes a lot of effort. You've made that effort to get here, you know? Like, you can make the next effort to make something fucking awesome and share what that is. So I'm actually hoping in the community minutes that you guys sort of throw around what you've been working on. I'd really, really love it if you can sort of, the thing you're doing now, I would be delighted if you can sort of say like something in your career that's gotten you to this, because you're actually giving clues to each other of how not just to have interesting careers and meaningful lives, but how to survive sometimes, right? Because it's not always easy to do these kind of roles that are on the outliers and not just a lawyer or an accountant or whatever that might be as technical creatives. It's a room full of people that can actually combine and say, here's how I got to where I'm doing. You know, here's the things that I learned. So I'll call up little Miss Sparkly Jacket here if I can. And what do you want to jump into the minutes or?
No, I just wanted to.
Yes.
Are you done?
Yes.